going to be asking you to help me by coming up with some examples of where you think some of the things that I'm talking about might fit. So I hope you will indulge and participate in this session and not just let me speak at you. So it is really, for me, it's a great opportunity to speak at this conference today and to consider the change that's going to be happening with the implementation of the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. And I think the timing of this has just been perfect because the Quality and Safeguards Commission comes into practice in WA on December 1st, which is 6 business days from today. Not that I'm counting down or anything. I've got a big sign at work on my whiteboard with the number of days. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions to start with. Can I just get a little bit of an indication how many people have heard about the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission? Oh, that's good. And how many people might be on or involved with an NDIS package of some sort? A fair number of people, great. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the change that the NDIS is bringing about to the way that disability services and our systems work, and then what the addition of the Quality and Safeguards Commission will be doing as part of that change. And I would like to one of the big things about the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission and the NDIS is that WA has been the last state to come on board when it was both the NDIS and now with the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. So in some ways, we hope that we're learning from what's happened in the other states, but we also know that there's a big push for, with these systems, having some national consistency. So a big part of what we'll be doing as part of bringing the Quality and Safeguards Commission in is bringing that national consistency to the way providers in the sector are regulated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So as we go, you're probably going to see me just drop pieces of paper on the ground, but you know what? That's okay. So I thought I'd start with just talking a little bit about how is quality and safeguarding different. The first point is that it's that nationally consistent approach. So the Quality and Safeguard Commission was developed following a lot of intensive consultation. And I know that advocacy organisations in WA were part of that consultation. It was a few years ago now, but I know when I was with PWdWA, we put in a submission to what the code of conduct needed to look like. All the ministers from every state agreed on what that framework was going to look like and agreed with having that national consistency. And everything that the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission does is supposed to fall underneath that framework of quality and safeguarding. And the framework is underlined by a few principles, the first being that it's about human rights. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is actually part of the NDIS legislation. It's in the principles of the legislation, and that the NDIS and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission is meant to be one of the ways that Australia is meeting its obligations of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The other thing about the framework is that it's also about choice and control, in that part of the framework, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, talks about having a developmental part of the framework, a developmental measure, which is really about how do we empower and support people with disability to have choice and control. The other part is national consistency, and proportionality. And proportionality is a big part of what the framework talks about, because that's about making sure that the actions that we take to enforce providers to do the right thing is actually proportionate to what they've might have done wrong, but also to the size of the provider, the types of support that they're providing, and what level of risk that support is to people as well. The framework also has a presumption of capacity. So it starts with that presumption that all people with disability have the capacity to make decisions and to exercise choice and control. And that's really important as well when we talk further about some of the things that are in the Code of Conduct. There's also an element of minimising red tape. So the framework is meant to try and streamline some systems and bring a whole pile of different functions that used to be done by different departments together. There's a couple of things that are really different to the way things have been done in the past as well, which for WA we need to be aware of. So in the previous state system, quality and safeguarding was actually managed by contracts between the service providers and the state government. So, you know, we're all aware that one of the big changes in the way the NDIS works is that the NDIS, if you've got an NDIS package, that money is either going in your name for you to choose what provider you want to use, and then you have a service agreement with a provider, or you might self-manage your funding and employ your own supports, or self-manage your funding and organise service agreements with providers yourself. In the previous system, providers had their agreements with the state government directly. So it was the state government that would then monitor the quality of providers through that funding contract. Because that funding contract isn't in place anymore, that's now a different way of doing things, which is part of why we have the Quality and Safeguards Commission coming in. I would also like to point out that because of the way that happened in the past, essentially the person that was providing the funding was also the person in charge of checking the quality of services. With the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission, we're actually a separate body to the National Disability Insurance Agency. So we don't have any say in funding, we don't have any say in the decisions made about people's plans, but what that means is that we're also very independent of those processes, and that we can regulate service providers without that being a factor that we're trying to manage in the way that we work. The other thing that in our state that we've had in the past is that if you've wanted to make a complaint about a disability service provider, you would have gone to HADSCO, the Health and Disability Services Complaints Office. Now HADSCO, because they do both health and disability services, we know that it's probably about 3 to 6% of all of their complaints are actually related to disability services, which is actually a really small amount. We know that when the Quality and Safeguards Commission has come into place in the other states, the number of complaints that have come through has been double, triple the amount that the previous state systems have got. And part of that is because we will now have complaints in the same place that we're also seeing the reporting that providers do, in the same place where we're looking at the quality of providers. So complaints becomes part of the intelligence gathering that we've got to know whether a provider is doing the right thing, and that it's the same body, the Quality and Safeguards Commission, that can then take action around those complaints. So these are some of the things that are going to be quite different from what has been happening in the past in WA. So I want to just talk a little bit about the framework that the Quality and Safeguards Commission is under. All right. So you'll see in the diagram on the PowerPoint, which I'll just go through so that you know what's on there, there are three dimensions of the NDIS quality and safeguarding framework. The first dimension is the developmental safeguards. So developmental safeguards are around building the capability and the support systems that enable people to be safe. For the Quality and Safeguards Commission, that means for us that we're communicating with people about what the obligations of service providers are, that we're communicating with people with disability and engaging with people with disability about how to make complaints and knowing what your rights are under the Code of Conduct. It's providing tools and resources. So things like on our website, we have what's called a behaviour support capability framework. And what that is, it's basically a tool that can help providers who are providing anything around behaviour support to know what is it that we expect a worker to be competent in and to be able to do if they're actually doing things in the behaviour support space. There's also a worker capability framework which actually lays out in a lot of detail, and it's coming soon. It lays out in a lot of detail what it is that a person with a disability can expect should be the capability, the competency of support workers that they're going to be working with. So that's part of what we do as part of the developmental aim of the framework. But that developmental safeguarding is actually something which is not just done by the Quality and Safeguards Commission. So in many ways, people's NDIS plans and how that's used to connect to community is also part of developmental safeguarding. The fact that if you've got more than one person in your life that you know that you can talk to if things are not going great, that's a developmental safeguard. That's actually about how we are involved and engaged with the community around us. It's things like whether you know your neighbour or know someone in your street that would actually notice if you didn't come out of your house for 6 months. That's what developmental safeguards are about. So the Commission has a little bit of a role in that, but it's also developmental safeguards are about the whole community and what the whole community is doing. The other part of that safeguarding framework is the preventative safeguards. So that starts to become part of the core role of what the Quality and Safeguards Commission is about. And that's where we have the Code of Conduct, which is part of legislation, the practice standards. The practice standards are essentially more detailed obligations that providers have to work to a certain standard if they're providing certain types of supports. Provider registration, so that's where all providers need to be registered with the Quality and Safeguards Commission if they're providing certain types of support that are considered to be higher risk supports. So for example, supported disability accommodation, if you're a provider that provides that, you need to be registered with the Commission because you're held to a higher level of accountability because that's a higher area where there's a higher risk, and we know that people have experienced abuse and neglect in those situations. Worker screening, which is coming in on the 1st of February. So I'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's something that's quite new. Incident management, which means that providers have to report if anything happens and what they've done to address anything that's happened. They have to report to the Quality and Safeguards Commission. So just before I talked about how complaints provide us with intelligence about what's happening with providers, incident reporting provides us with the other part of that intelligence that we're getting to know whether providers are doing the right thing and that they're actually taking action when they need to. Then the third part of that Quality and Safeguard framework, which underlines what the Commission does, is the corrective domain. And I'm sorry if this is sounding, I hope that, I can see some people nodding. So, every now and then I might just poke the bear and check that you're all awake. But the corrective domain, and this is the sort of new part, which is exciting and scary at the same time, and quite new for disability service providers, is that we have a whole range of enforcement actions that we can take under our legislation. And we start by trying to educate providers, persuade them to do the right thing, check that they're compliant, and you'll hear that word compliance quite a lot. Check that somebody's actually doing what they should be doing. But then we can also do things like we can put extra conditions on their registration if they're not meeting what we think they should be doing. We can provide compliance notices, so we can make a provider change their way they're doing things to ensure that they're complying with the standards. We can put infringement notices in place where we put in fines and ask providers to pay a fine or a civil penalty. We can refuse or revoke someone's registration if they're not doing the right thing, and we can ban a provider. And we have banned a number of sole trader providers, as well as the provider from South Australia, Integrity Care, over the 2 years that the Commission has been in place. Obviously, to get banned, that's pretty serious. And we can ban a provider for a limited amount of time as well. But that's basically that framework of those 3 domains is what underpins the Quality and Safeguards Commission. So I'll just talk a little bit about the Commission. So we regulate the NDIS market. And so again, you'll hear that word regulation, which is something which in the state system previously, they would have talked about quality evaluation. And although quality is part of what we do, you'll hear people talk about that we're a regulator, which is a bit like, who's heard of the WorkSafe? Yep. So that WorkSafe is a regulator of work health and safety. And so they can go in and, fine people, ban people, things like that. So that's similar to the Quality and Safeguards Commission in terms of being what a regulator is. So we regulate every provider who delivers NDIS supports, including those that are unregistered. So you'll hear that talk about registered providers and unregistered providers. Unregistered providers are anybody that, say, someone who's self-managing or plan managing could choose to use an unregistered provider. Just because a provider is unregistered doesn't mean that they're not covered by us. And in fact, a majority of those that have been banned have been unregistered providers. And the reason they're covered under us is because they are still required to meet the code of conduct. And we can still take complaints about an unregistered provider and take action about how that fits with the code of conduct. So I'll talk a bit more in detail about the code of conduct in a moment. But what we are is we're a system level player. And what that means is that through the actions that we take, we're trying to lift the quality of services across the whole sector. So when we're banning providers or, getting to that really heavy end of things, we want people to know, because we want providers across the whole sector to know that they need to lift their game. But we also know that we need to spend some time educating providers about what that looks like as well. So that's where it's that sort of dual focus of going through education all the way up to the heavy duty stuff. So just looking at what's on the slide, we've got that we will take over the registration of providers from the NDIA, because that's where currently providers are registered. We're going to provide that national consistency and help providers to meet their obligations. And part of that will also be about resolving problems and trying to identify areas for improvement with providers. But it's really that trying to support continuous improvement and trying to also shift the way people think about quality. We want providers to think about getting complaints as actually a process for continuous improvement, not as a ticker box part of the paperwork that they have to do. We want providers to think about their reporting of incidents as a way of us knowing what's happening across the whole sector to keep people, to uphold people's rights, not about ticking a box for us. So it's about shifting that thinking. And part of that role is as well providing that best practice information. So that's where I talked before about having the capability frameworks which get that best practice thinking. Making sure I've got the right bits of paper here. I'm going to skip over this one a little bit. This slide just talks about the functions of the Commission. So the Code of Conduct, which I'm going to go into more detail about. Registration and quality assurance, which that's more, providers really need to know about registration, and there's a lot of information on our website that providers can get. Complaints, which I'll talk a bit more about. Reportable incidents, so that's that monitoring of the, if something happened, so there's a whole range of particular things that providers need to report to us if something happens, so like the death of a participant, serious injury. But our role as the Quality and Safeguards Commission is not to do something about those incidents, it's to actually check that the provider has done the right thing and taken the action that they need to take. Behaviour support. So behaviour support is an area where we know there's a higher risk of people having restrictive practices used which don't need to be used, potentially leading to neglect, abuse, physical abuse. As the Senator said this morning, it's often akin to torture. So we have a specific arm of the NDIS Commission that is all about behaviour support and about trying to build the capability of the sector to understand what positive behaviour support is and to try and work towards that reducing and eliminating the use of restrictive practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. The worker screening area and the behaviour support area are both areas that we do in conjunction with the state. So they're what's called a co-regulatory function. I know that sounds a little bit boring, but what it means is we're just working together with the state. It's not just the Quality and Safeguards Commission by itself. And of course, the compliance, investigations and enforcement functions. They're the people that you won't necessarily see out and about talking and engaging with people. But they're the people that when shit gets, hits the fan, they're the people that come on board and make sure stuff gets done. So we have every state operations of the Quality and Safeguards Commission have an investigations team where we can take investigations ourselves. And often the people that are in those roles are people that have come from police or areas like that that are used to doing that type of full investigations. Code of conduct. Now, this is the stuff that I really wanted to talk about because I think this is really important for people to know. And this is where I might ask for some help from you guys. So the Code of Conduct sets the minimum expectations of the sector. And it's about helping to try and shape the behaviour and the culture of providers and workers. So it's a clear statement about what we expect as people with disability. So anyone can raise a complaint with the NDIS Commission about providers or workers who breach the Code of Conduct. And the Code of Conduct applies to all providers and workers, including registered NDIS providers, unregistered NDIS providers, whether they're delivering services or ILC, information linkages and capacity building projects, as well as the Commonwealth Continuity of Support Program or other services. The LAC partners and the early childhood intervention partners are also required to abide by the Code of Conduct. And if people breach the Code of Conduct, we can take action. So I did want to just talk a bit about how you can find out more about the Code of Conduct, but also to talk about some examples so that we can get a bit of an idea of what does that actually mean. Has anyone had a look at the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission website? A few people have. Anybody taken the worker orientation module? I can see a couple of people. I would strongly recommend, even though it says it's a worker orientation module, I think that it's actually vitally important that people with disabilities, if you're using support workers or using services, take the worker orientation module, because what it does is it actually goes through in 90 minutes. It goes through what the Code of Conduct is and gives specific examples of what the Code of Conduct means in practice. And it's actually got, I don't know if anyone checked out Playback Theatre across the road. So one of the theatre groups that's quite similar to that in New South Wales actually does the whole section of the Code of Conduct in the worker orientation module, and they do an absolutely fantastic job. It is really engaging. So please do have a look if you can. So although that's focused about support workers, it's important for people with disability and families to know, because if you want to make a complaint, you need to know what it is that you're complaining about and what the standards are that workers are expected to meet. So let's have a look at the code. So one of the first things in the code is that workers need to act with respect for individual rights to freedom of expression, self-determination and decision-making in accordance with applicable laws and conventions. So this is about people making decisions about their own life. And when they need to, it's about being supported to make decisions. And so there really is a strong emphasis on supported decision making, if you've heard that term before, in the way that the Code of Conduct is framed. And it's also about individual expression and culture. So when I was trying to think about, well, what might this mean? An example for me would be that I wouldn't want a support person that works with me to be treating me differently or treating me in a lesser way because I don't believe in the same religion as them, for example. Another example might be where a person with support workers, say going to TAFE or something like that, and they want to meet friends after, their support worker helps them with their travel and getting to and from. And the support worker goes to that person's parents to ask about getting permission for the person to be able to go and meet with friends. That would be a breach of that aspect of the Code of Conduct. So I'm going to ask if you guys have any ideas on, like, if any examples that you think you could give that you think where someone might be an example of acting with respect for individual rights to freedom of expression, self-determination and decision-making. I can see a couple of people there.
I'm just curious that when you talk about that the provider has actually taken action, is that with respect to what the person with disability that made the complaint is satisfied by, or is it by what the NDIS Code of Safeguards Commission is satisfied? Because oftentimes it seems like there's lashback from providers when a complaint or even a feedback is made. And if the commission made the person with disability the one who got to say whether it had been actually resolved, that would be best, I think.
No, so anybody can make a complaint to the Commission and we can investigate based on that complaint. It doesn't have to be by the person with the disability.
Well,
We
if
don't
it
have to
is,
name
though,
the person of the disability, and the person with the disability doesn't have to have made the complaint with the provider before coming to us either.
fair enough, but my statement is that with the power differential that is often there with provider and client, that the idea of regulating the industry, you would hope that there would be some kind of, because you were saying making sure that that the provider follows through and does the right thing by the person that made the complaint. But it would have to be the person said that actually happened, not just somebody else.
Not necessarily. So we take complaints from other support workers. We take complaints from doctors, other people. It doesn't have to be the person with the disability.
I feel like there should be some kind
Sorry.
of primacy put on us, because the industry is meant to be protecting us. You know what I'm saying?
So the way, I guess, I do know what you're saying to it, and I get what you're saying. As a commission, we can investigate a provider based on a whole range of factors. It's not just about if it's only when a complaint comes in.
I understand, but what about when a complaint does come in? What would incentivize a person to do this, to assist in the process of regulation, if there isn't any kind of safeguards in place to make sure that that is taken in good faith and there's actually some kind of, structural process to ensure that that safety is maintained? Because I don't know about anybody else, but if you give feedback, oftentimes it's not well received. you know.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. So that's part of where we've got a whole range of different mechanisms that we can use to ensure. So part of it is about the education and monitoring that the Commission can do. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about, it's not based on one incident only. It's actually about monitoring the compliance of providers all the time or across different ways. So maybe we could have a conversation afterwards to explain a bit more, or
fair enough.
to hear
I just
what
wonder
how
many people are going to give honest feedback if that's not somehow ensured. But sure, we can talk about it for ages.
Yeah, I guess there's lots of different ways that, like, we're not relying on only one incident or one complaint. It's actually, so the registration, the audits that providers have to do on a regular basis, the incident reporting that we can then go and monitor and go and check in, as well as complaints. So there's multiple
it was
different
that checking
mechanisms.
in that I was the most concerned with, like hoping that there was some like actual substance to that, to making sure that like people, if they weren't being treated okay, that then there was some kind of outcome that made sure that they were being treated okay.
Yeah, and that's part of some of the enforcement actions we can take, as well as the monitoring role that we can take.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Child in the park. Okay, just as an example, I'm meeting a child, a loved one, in the park as prearranged, and the support worker's not allowing the individual out of the car because there might have been an incident a little bit earlier. But the young autistic man was well behaved, excited to see his parent, but unfortunately the support workers took umbrage at the fact that the father wanted his son to come out and have the picnic, which was prearranged, and these support workers wouldn't allow him, even though he was obviously happy and more than capable of continuing with the picnic. So they prevented that. Now, would that be an indictable? Would that be a reportable offence, do you think?
Yes.
I would think so. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm going to keep going through the different areas of the Code of Conduct, but I'm going to ask for other examples if you've got them as we go through. So the next one is respect for privacy of people with disabilities. So one of the examples I had seen before is providers sending out email without BCCing to a whole number of clients that they might have. Or another example I've seen, and this is from my own past, having lived in a more institutionalised setting when I was younger, where support workers would leave a door open when someone's showering in the bathroom or getting dressed in their bedroom. So that's the sort of, from my perspective, that's not meeting that code of conduct around respect for privacy. I don't know if anyone else had any examples of what that might look like in practice, respect for privacy. I can see in the middle there.
Maybe like when the support worker goes to the client's house and bringing along people that they do not know. So that would be a breach of privacy, knowing where they live, a serious breach.
So a support worker bringing somebody that the person hasn't
That's
agreed to
unknown
be
to
there
them.
or is unknown to them.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next one of the code of conduct is acting with integrity, honesty, and transparency. So I was thinking about this and thinking about an example where a provider, and this is an example we've got on our website in one of the detailed documents there, where a provider advises a person and a family that they'd benefit from counselling as part of the service, because the person's talked about being anxious. And then the person says they'd like to access that service as part of the service, and the service provider said, oh, sorry, we've got some delays about that. And then on investigation, it's found out that the provider's actually not registered to provide that sort of service, but didn't tell the person. So did you have an example, Andrew? I saw your hand.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate that. It's a little bit different to that, but a similar vein of integrity. Service provider, I was in a multidisciplinary team meeting, 7 minutes on a phone call. I spoke 2 words to a service provider and was billed for half an hour.
Yeah, so there's some of these, it's good to try and think about what a practical example might look like, because it's hard to tell just from the words. Yeah, thank you for that. Another one, provider supports, that services provide supports and services in a safe and competent manner with care and skill. So an example of this would be maybe a person, a worker sees that a person they support is having difficulty with some physical tasks, maybe due to muscle weakness or related to their disability. The worker says, oh, my friends reckon I give a good massage, so I can do massages for you every day. And then the person's physical health gets worse. And the worker admits that actually they've had no training in therapeutic massage, and they really hadn't thought about what the effect might be, and they didn't know enough about the person's disability to know that it would actually have a bad outcome. So that's again that what does competent and with care and skill mean in practice? So I don't know if anyone can think about an example. Leighton at the back there, I thought you might be a good one to have some examples.
Yeah, I was in the Kimberley last week and talking to a lot of Aboriginal providers up there in Aboriginal communities, and a lot of the discussion was about culturally safe practice for what actually works and applies in those lands. And there was a really good example from the MJD Foundation in the Northern Territory with a particularly rare genetic disease that has afflicted quite a lot of members of a community on Groot Island, and the way that the provider over there has really worked very hard to make sure the service provision is culturally informed and culturally safe was a fantastic example.
Thank you. That's a great example. The next part of the Code of Conduct is that services promptly take steps to raise and act on concerns about matters that may impact the quality and safety of supports and services provided to persons with disability. So this is really about people having the right to feel safe and to make complaints and to have complaints acted on. So this is that sort of comes to some of, I think, what you were talking about before, where if a person complains to a manager or a complaints officer in a service about the way someone has treated them, like a support worker, that the provider has to listen and have a process to address that complaint, and that the person knows that there's not going to be retribution, or even in the case of another support worker raising an issue about the safety of a person, that they should be able to do so without fear of any retribution. It's also where, maybe if a serious incident occurs, that providers should have a process for reporting and taking action to ensure people are safe. And that might be making sure that that worker that's been complained about is actually not left staying working with the person, because there's a risk then of retribution. I don't know if anyone else had any particular examples about that one. Yeah.
What would happen if the service provider didn't lodge a SIR and actually believed a support worker over the participant?
So that's where the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, we have our own investigation arm, that if we didn't feel something was being looked at appropriately, we can do further investigation ourselves.
So if, just going back to a previous slide, the Disability Act 2013, does that get replaced by the current 2020 NDIS Act? Like, say if something happened in 2018, 2019, the NDIS Safeguard Commission wasn't brought out then?
Yeah, so unfortunately we don't do anything that's retrospective. So
Okay.
For people here in WA, it will be anything that happens from December 1st.
Okay then.
Yep.
So nothing would get done then as making people accountable?
Well, it's from December 1st, but for things that have been previous in the previous systems, it would still be going through HADSCO or through Department of Communities at the moment.
Yeah, so they're just like a reporting body that they don't actually take action. So who would take action?
If it was criminal, the police should be contacted.
Yeah. What about civil?
At this point in time, it would be, I would suggest needing to speak to an advocacy organisation probably.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Unfortunately, we don't come into effect until that actual December 1st turnover. Was that another question or example?
Microphone for you. Hi. My query is not so much about the person with a disability being able to make concerns or whatever through the commission, but what if there is a support worker who works for an agency who has the NDIS contract, for want of a better word, and their agency doesn't give them the support and the tools and the correct financial support for doing their job.
So that's not in our remit.
Okay.
That would need to be through whether that's potentially union or other mechanisms. Support workers, if a support worker wanted to make a complaint about a provider or provide intelligence to the commission, then they could do that. And there's actually, in the legislation, there's also provision for whistleblower protections for support workers that might want to raise issues about a provider in terms of the way they're working with people with disabilities and in terms of their performance and systems from that perspective. So that would be one of the ways that could happen.
Unfortunately, particularly with the recent COVID, this has been an area where the agencies that I'm aware of, their support workers have been severely let down by the agencies that they work for. And as a person who received services, that people need to work. So, yeah, it's very disappointing to think that an organisation the most important part of their organisation is their support workers, and they're basically tossed aside.
Thank you. I just want to go like the last of the code of conduct, which is to take all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to all forms of violence against and exploitation, neglect and abuse of people with disability. So this includes the reducing and eliminating of restrictive practices. It's also about providers removing workers from working with someone if there's been an issue raised about abuse and neglect, and keeping a worker in place. And then the last of the code of conduct, and this is there because it needs to be spelt out specifically, is to take all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to sexual misconduct. So an example of that might be where a support person or a professional, asks someone about their sexual preferences in detail, or tells a person about their own, or makes sexually suggestive comments about a person without their consent. And part of that, the one before that about taking reasonable steps, would also include where if there was actual sexual assault or abuse or harassment, that a provider, if that's been reported to them, should be going to the police and going to all of the relevant authorities. So the Commission itself, although we have a role to play, we're not the police, and it's not our job to take over that role. And it's really important that we ensure that both people with disabilities and providers understand that that's actually still a vitally important part of what providers need to do. So that code of conduct, that's the code that applies to all providers, whether they're registered or not. So I did want to just briefly touch on complaints. This is probably the area where most people with disabilities will have interaction with the Quality and Safeguards Commission. So NDIS participants have the right to complain about the safety and quality of NDIS supports and services. And every NDIS provider also must have, if they're registered, an effective complaints management and resolution arrangement. But this is where I was saying before that we don't expect that a person with a disability has to have made a complaint to the provider before coming to us, because we understand that power imbalance. So that's not something that we say has to happen. Obviously, one of the things we're aiming for in that, trying to raise the quality of the whole sector, is to actually get that change of thinking, to have providers recognise that complaints are part of a continuous improvement process, and it's good quality, good practice to get feedback. So we handle complaints about providers, and we take all complaints seriously. For some people, depending on the complaint, we can help facilitate a resolution process. But for others, we might need to investigate, and that's where we have our own investigations arm. And really, again, complaints are that opportunity for providers to improve service delivery. Reportable incidents is the other part that providers are required to do. So So I have got just listed here what a provider needs to report. So I know there may be some providers in the audience, but it's also good for people to know, because if you know of an incident that's happened, you can ask your provider, has this been reported? And what action are you taking? So incidents that must be reported to the Quality and Safeguards Commission are death of a participant, serious injury, abuse or neglect, unlawful sexual or physical contact, sexual misconduct including grooming, and the unauthorised use of restrictive practices. And that unauthorised use of restrictive practices is actually something that's very new, and it's not about, whether it's authorised or not. It's not actually about that we're saying this is something that should happen. But for the first time, we're actually getting a picture of how much restrictive practice is used in the sector because it's being reported, and how much is not being used in a way, just one moment, Simon, not being used in a way which is actually got a process in place to try and reduce that practice. And so the whole aim of that process of reporting restrictive practices is to try and get that shift to having positive behaviour plans in place, positive support strategies in place, and reduce with the aim of eliminating restrictive practices. Simon, you had a question? We'll just get the microphone to you.
Just wondering if you could clarify that term, restrictive practices. I'm getting a bit confused with what that means in this context.
Absolutely. So under our rules, there's some specific definitions about restrictive practice, and so they come in, and apologies if I haven't got all of them here. I'm just having a look to see if my notes actually have the full list. But it is, there are mechanical restraints. So that would be if someone was, buckled in to their wheelchair or restrained in that way. There's chemical restraints, and that's where if someone's given medication for the purpose of controlling behaviour, that's not the same as medication that might be therapeutic or for a specific purpose related to someone's disability. So epilepsy medication, for example, wouldn't be included if someone has epilepsy, but if someone's been given psychotropic medication when they don't actually have any psychiatric illness that they should be getting that medication for, but it's being used to control behaviour, then that's a chemical restraint. Environmental restraints, that can be where cupboards are locked, doors are locked, people might be locked in their home or their room. Sorry, forgive me now, I'm also, and there's a couple more, but they're the main ones. I'm looking to people I know in the room who might know what the other ones are. Undue influence, so trying to convince people, psychosocial restraint. So, but they are listed on the website, and it's been a real shift, and I'm just going to go to the next slide there. So behaviour support, we actually have a team of people who can support understanding a bit more about what behaviour support plans look like, what we mean when we're talking about trying to shift that thinking about restrictive practices. As I said, it's a really important area, and any behaviour support plan that has a restrictive practice in it needs to be authorised, and the idea is that those plans should be aimed at a plan to eliminate or reduce that restrictive practice. And so by reporting them to the Quality and Safeguards Commission, we can actually monitor and check that that's actually happening over time. So the Commission's been in place for 2 years, and at the moment 80-something% of all of the reporting that's happening in other states is restrictive practices, which goes to show how prevalent that is and how much we need to change that culture. Just aware that we're moving on with time, and I do want to allow for a couple more questions at the end. So I did have a slide here about worker screening. Worker screening will come into effect on the 1st of February in 2021. So that will be where registered providers will have to ensure that workers have a valid clearance. So it's a bit like the Working with Children check, and that there'll be some ongoing monitoring. But the big change is that because that's national, you won't have the situation which has happened in the past where a worker might have been banned or an issue had happened in another state, they've moved states and then just got a job with another provider. So that national worker screening will come into effect on the 1st of February. I can see a couple of people with questions there about that. I may only be able to give a small answer because it's still new and in development.
Hi, Sam. I did have one question really quickly. We know that the NDIS is designed to only support a small proportion of people with disability in the community. I'm wondering, is the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission willing to take complaints from providers who are providing NDIS-like services, or the complaint has resulted from a person who doesn't have an NDIS plan?
If the complaint is related to a provider that's registered, then yes. With other areas, we will have information sharing with other relevant agencies so that we're getting some sharing of sort of the general intelligence that we can. But no, we actually, our remit is only NDIS. I think there's a couple of questions there. I'm just aware of the time, so if we could just keep it to the one question, please.
Yep. My name's Teresa. I've got a 22-year-old son with a moderate intellectual disability, and I suppose he's had plans for the last nearly 4 years in New South Wales, and we've seen the light and come back to WA. But it's around, as families, we are encouraged under the NDIS to get more value for money. And some of that can entail us directly employing or having independent support workers. Things that we have had quite a bit of experience with is actually monetary fraud, behaviour sort of stuff towards our son. So that's something that we've individually managed as a family, and we've actually had those fraudulent actions. We've managed that ourselves, but I would assume with independent support workers, that is something that we could also, as family members, move back and make a complaint in relation to that to the Safeguards Commission. Yes, it's an area which is still under development. If there's fraud is actually still being covered by the NDIA. Okay, yeah. So that's the one area which is still being covered by the NDIA, the fraud area. Yeah. However, often what we find is that there's often multiple things. It's not just fraud. So sometimes, we're working together with the NDIA on those sorts of issues. Yeah. And just quickly, I'm a health professional as well, so I'm actually bound by mandatory reporting. How does that come in and fit in with the Safeguards Commission? So that would be under certification. So if you're already under professional accreditation, say like, physiotherapists, psychologists, things like that, you have your own professional accreditation. So there's a different level of registration and expectation under the commission, but I can have a chat to you about that further if you like. I did want to just quickly show the pyramid. So this is the compliance pyramid, which essentially it just is a pyramid here which goes from the very bottom layer of the pyramid, which has education, persuasion, compliance support, and then essentially the more serious the level of harm and the more engagement a provider or the less engagement a provider has in wanting to change, then the further up the pyramid we can go in the enforcement action we can take. So we might start with education and persuasion on the bottom of the pyramid, move up to investigation, conditions of registration, then we might move up to compliance notices, enforcement undertaking. I know some of these are quite complex words and terms, but essentially
we go all the way up to infringement notices, civil penalties and banning. And by the time you're at banning, that's where providers are really they're not willing to change. There's a serious risk, harm has happened. So the question was, if the provider's been banned, how do you know? So we actually have a section on our website where there's a list of the banned providers. And generally, as with Integrity Care in South Australia, those are the sorts of issues which are generally in the media as well. They're banned from providing the services to NDIS participants. Yep. I just very quickly, when we come in December 1st, you will notice if there's any COVID issues that the NDIS Commission will start making provider alerts to providers about those issues and what their obligations are. And there's a lot more information about that on our website as well. So I won't go into detail though, because we've run out of time. But what I do have with me up on stage here is I have some fridge magnets with our contact centre number so that people can be prepared from December 1st. I have some flyers and some bookmarks as well. So please feel free to come and grab some of that material.
Folks, please show your appreciation for Samantha Jenkinson. Thank you very much. Folks, it is now afternoon tea time. Please enjoy that, and our next sessions will begin after that. Thank you.